Hey there! Welcome to Professor Purl, a YouTube channel about knitting. I'm Nicole, and this is a video about test knitting. About 3 weeks ago on YouTube, I uploaded a video about why I love test knitting. So if you follow me on profpurl on Instagram or follow me over here on YouTube, you probably know that I really like test knitting a lot, and I've test knit a lot of sweaters over the past year or so. And so in that video, I talk about why I love test knitting. So this is the sequel to that, where we will talk about like how do you apply for test knitting and what makes a good test knitter. And that came up because in that video there was a lot of questions kind of centered around those two main ideas, which is like, how do I find test knitting things, how do I apply for them, and what is a good test knitter. And then today on Instagram, I put out a question just like, what other questions do you have? And I will answer those at the end as well. So let's get into it. So if you have some knitting, it would be really fun for us to knit together and hang out. I'm on my porch here in Oregon, and I'm working on a test knit. This is the inside of my Barbie crop from Knitting Ruined My Life. And it's a colorwork cropped sweater that has a Barbie theme. And so, yeah, I'm loving it. And yeah, I thought it would be fun to talk about test knitting while I'm working on my test knit. The main question I was asked on the last test knitting video was, how do I apply for test knitting? So I thought I would share my 3 strategies for applying for test knitting, and then maybe offer some that I've heard from some of my friends. And then if you have any suggestions about how you apply for test knitting that I've missed, I'd love to know what those are, and I'd love for those to be in the comments, and I can pin them at the top for other people to see. So the first way that I apply for test knits is by signing up for designers' newsletters that I like. So before I got into test knitting, I just really liked knitting garments, all kinds of things, vests, sweaters, children's sweaters. And so, I mean, from that, you glean an idea of like what designers you really like. And so many designers have a newsletter on their website you can sign up for, and then testing calls are announced through those newsletters. And actually, I think some designers exclusively send their testing calls through the newsletters. So I know Jessie Made Designs does test knitting calls through the newsletter. Anna from the Bluebird Box does it through the newsletter. My friend Anina from Annie Hoodie Knits in Norway, I think she does it through a newsletter too. So yeah, like the newsletter is a good place to start. The second place that I find test knitting calls is through following the designers on Instagram or Ravelry. Now, maybe you use Instagram and you don't use Ravelry, or you use Ravelry and you don't use Instagram. But I would say one of those platforms is like a good one to be at if you want to get into test knitting. So I think there's some testing calls that are put in Ravelry threads, like Caitlin Hunter from Boylan Knitworks. Her testing calls are done on Ravelry. And I also think Tammy Gore, who I've test knit for, I think hers, if I recall, are also through her Ravelry groups. So both Boylan Knitworks and Tammy Gore, they have their own like Ravelry group because they're designers with like beautiful designs, lots of them. So there's lots of people over there for other things chatting, but in their threads, there's usually like a thread that'll pop up about a test knitting call. Now, that's very hard for me personally because I don't use Ravelry a lot. And I often miss the test knitting calls because of that. And yeah, so that's, you know, a challenge for the social media platforms sometimes. But I think that's also the challenge of the newsletters too, because you have to check your email. So the other way I will see test knitting calls is on Instagram. And I have a little strategy embedded with Instagram. I'm not just gonna say Instagram broadly. So basically on Instagram, sometimes like you'll be following a designer that you really like. For example, Purl from Knitting Room My Life. I love all her designs. Laura Penrose, I love all her designs. I follow Laura and I follow Purl on Instagram, and sometimes they'll have a little peek about what they have coming up. Oh, Anna from the Bluebird box. My last test that I finished was the Vintage Vibe vest. This is a great analogy or example. I saw this vest when Anna first made it in October or November. I had no idea if she was gonna write it up as a design, but I knew I loved that vest, and I was just like watching her Instagram for the moment she said that she was writing it up. And then I was like, okay, I'm gonna just keep an eye on her page for when she posts the test knitting call. Anna does it both on Instagram and on the newsletter too. So anyway, I kept my eye open. And same thing with this one. I knew that Purl had some really fun things going on, and so I was just watching her Instagram, and the second this was posted as a test knitting call, I went into her bio and there was a link, a link tree, and I clicked on it and I applied. And in nearly all of the cases, not all, but in many of the cases, applying for a test knit included filling out a Google form, which is essentially a survey where I would need to provide my email, my socials, what my handle on Instagram and Ravelry were, what size I wanted to test, etc. In some cases, the testing calls have been send me an email, things like this, but in most cases it's been a Google form, and then you hear if you're testing. I've never received an email you weren't selected. It was just get an email if you were selected. So that's kind of interesting. Yeah, so my friend Brenda, she's gotten into test knitting sweaters as well. And her strategy, from what I can tell, is similar to mine, but also a little different. She joined a Ravelry group just on test knitting. So it's a group where designers will come to this group and say, hey, looking for test knitters for this. And she's testing a lot from that, so that can be an option too. And then I thought of something that I don't do, but I think it could work too, which is there is a hashtag on Instagram called test knitting and test knitters, and there's test knitters wanted. And so I was thinking maybe you could follow those hashtags, and that could also be a way too, though I haven't done it because I feel like I've got enough going on. I haven't needed to look for another outlet of how to, but so hopefully those give you a nice start if you're interested in getting into test knitting on how to start. If you are watching this video and you have test knit, you should definitely share below how you find out about test knits, particularly if it's different than what I shared, because this is just what I do and I don't know if it's what other people do. So yeah, I would love to hear about that. Okay, in this next section, I'm going to talk about what I think makes a good test knitter. So it's sort of advice for how to be a good test knitter. And the disclaimer here is this is my opinion. You may disagree with that, and that's okay. So this is just my opinion on what makes a good test knitter. So I think the first thing to being a good test knitter starts at the very beginning, and that's you shouldn't apply for a test knit unless you think you will be able to have or make time to do the test knit. So like if you know that you've already committed to, you know, knitting socks for your entire family for Christmas and knitting your friend a sweater, and you know, like that's maybe not the best time to apply for a test knit. Like, so yeah. So I think the first thing is like, do you have time? And I think I always like this interest, not to be super philosophical here, but like this whole like, do you have time thing? Like, none of us have time. Like, we're just, you know, we're busy. So like the whole like have time thing, like I think it's more like, are you going to make space for it? And it's okay not to make space for test knitting. It's really okay. And so if that's the key, so I think like being aware that you don't have time, just then don't apply and wait till the pattern comes out and when you can knit it at a casual speed. So making it a priority, I guess, is important. The next piece of advice I have is to stay in communication with the designer. I'm knitting, so I'm just going to take a peek here at my chart. Yeah, so my next piece of advice is to stay in communication with the designer. So I think that that's just like a good piece of like life advice, is just stay in communication. You know, stay in communication with your partners. If you're a student, stay in communication with your teacher. Like it's just a good idea. And so ways that's been important is like, I remember I was doing a secret test knit. Side note, I have still not shown this on my channel. I don't know when I can show it. I was doing a secret test knit and I wasn't going to make the deadline. I was really close, but I wasn't going to make the deadline exactly. And I felt a little nervous, but I decided to stay in communication with the designer. And I asked if I could have 2 more days. And it worked out great. The designer was like, yeah, there's time for 2 more days. You can have that. And so that minimized my stress. The designer knew I was like finishing this for them. So it all worked out. I'm trying to knit a chart and film a YouTube video at the same time. So like decisions were made here. Okay. So I think my next piece of advice is maybe just like the first piece of advice, which is to make your test knitting your priority. Like there's stuff going on right now. Like I think next week's sock week. And I really like probably need to do sock week because I have a lot of single socks. And so it would be fun to knit a sock in a week and have a full finished pair. But I'm not done with this test knit. So I said to myself, until this is done, I'm not going to do sock week. And, you know, maybe that's not for you. Like maybe you're like, you want to do the things like, you know, knit alongs. You're like, okay, I want to do sock week and I want to do this. And you should do that because knitting's fun. So you should do what brings you joy. So like, yeah. So make it your priority, but I would just say that's also just good advice, knitting advice of like, make whatever brings you joy your priority, like, right? So then the next thing is to keep your socials up to date. And this can help you be selected for test knitters too. Like, for instance, if your Ravelry is not up to date, like, and you apply for a test knit, I don't know what a designer might think. They might think like, maybe that's not what I'm going to pick because they need to be up to date. Or maybe a designer won't think that at all because I'm pretty terrible about keeping my Ravelry up to date and I still end up test knitting. But I think it's a good idea to keep the Ravelry up to date. I have 2 patterns out and 1 in progress now. And the 2 I have out are 2 sock designs, and I have a shawl design that's being tested now. And I know that like I really like it when my testers put the Ravelry project in, and it means a lot to me. And so like I can see that being an important thing to keep up to date. Also, keeping your Instagram up to date, like posting your finished projects on Instagram, if that's up to date, I think that can be very appealing too, in like lieu of Ravelry even, right? Because like some people use Instagram instead of Ravelry, I feel like, to post their pictures. So yeah, so pick one though, right? Like maybe it's hard to keep both up, but maybe pick one to focus on. I'm actually not good at posting my pictures at either places, and that's an area of growth for me. For instance, I finished my Vintage Vibe, that test knit for Anna from the Bluebird box, and I finished it on time, but I do not have any photos up still. And this vest is out and it's incredible, but I still don't have any finished object photos of it yet. And I think partly it's just the weather, because it's like pretty warm here and I don't want to wear my vest quite yet. But it would be a really great summer project because people could knit the vest now and then have it in the fall. And so anyway, I need a picture of that. And what ends up happening is sometimes to me is I forget to take these pictures, and then enough time lapses and I never take a picture. Like I finished my Advent socks from Woolens and Nosh this summer, and I also haven't posted those on Instagram. So like I think like there's this like old saying that's like, do as I say, not as I do. Like, so that's an area of growth for me. Okay, so my next piece of advice is, I wrote down, is to take good notes and measurements. So yeah, take good notes and measurements of your finished object and as you're going along. So for instance, with my color work, I will measure my leftover yarn. I measured it before and I'll measure it after to know exactly how many grams I used. I did a gauge swatch of this. So yes, you should gauge swatch for test knitting, particularly for a garment. And some people will argue, like, why do a gauge swatch if it's just going to change in the garment? Because sometimes you'll do a gauge swatch and then you'll knit your whole garment and the gauge turns out a little different. But I think it's so important for the test knitting, because you need to know, you need to try to get gauge, right? So if this ends up not getting gauge, like what can I do at this point? But I'm sure the designer would much prefer me to have gauge, and so that's why I do the gauge swatch at the beginning, to ensure that I'm getting or trying to get gauge. And if it doesn't turn out here, I can be honest about that, but like attempting gauge is important. And then with the sweater, I will measure it before I wet block it, and I will measure it after I wet block it, and I'll record all those. And I often keep those kinds of notes like in a notebook, so I just keep it with me while I'm knitting in case I want to say something. Every designer like handles that differently. I've test knit for people who have you just post it in the Ravelry group or email them, but some designers, I know that I'm doing this one, so I know for Marl of Knitting Ruined My Life, for the Barbie crop, like as soon as she sent out the test knit with the pattern, she had a Google form, so I know what kinds of information she's going to be asking for at the end. And I think that's important for the designers because they have schematics and things like this and certain yardage that they may like recommend. And so I think the designers want to know like if it's coming out the way that they say it's going to come out and what they're writing, and will you have enough yarn and things like that. So maybe you're not a gauge swatcher, but I think that if you're knitting a garment for a test knit, that you really should gauge swatch. Okay, the other thing that I think makes a really good test knitter is someone who takes good pictures, and they do not need to be professional quality. Like I do not take professional quality photos, but I do think that they should have good lighting. You want to make sure that the picture you're taking and you're posting on Ravelry, or the picture that you're posting on Instagram, that these like show off the garment or the object you're test knitting. And I think that helps not just the designer and communicating like this thing they've designed, but I also think it helps other knitters decide, is that something I want to knit? Because sometimes a designer knits something in a particular color and then somebody knits it in a different way. And that different way actually speaks to somebody else and helps them envision how they might do the project. I think like even with this Barbie crop, oh my gosh, there's somebody, I think they're called the Discreet Unicorn on Instagram, and their neon version of this Barbie crop is everything. Like, it's so good. Like, and they use way more colors than, like, this is a three, like the main body, and then you can see two other colors, and like they didn't do that. They did like these are two different colors and this is a third color, and then down here these are like a fourth and fifth color. It's so good. And then, oh, I wish I could remember the handle. Somebody did, like, when I think of Barbie, I think of pink and like black. I mean, obviously that's, I mean, like literal interpretation here, but somebody did kind of a blue and white version, which is like super cool. And so I think the more different versions and takes, it feels, I know you're knitting somebody else's pattern, but it feels very artistic to me. And so these different sort of interpretations of it, I think can be very helpful to see, to get other people excited about it too, and envision how they might do it. So those are the ways that I see like being a good test knitter, and I'm sure there's things I'm missing and things, you know, that I'm not thinking about, but I thought it might be helpful to hear what I think makes a good test knitter. And maybe you're thinking of something that I'm not, you know, maybe you're watching this and you're a designer, and maybe you're watching this and you test knit a lot and feel like I forgot something, and I would love to know what that is, because I can always pin that comment below and it can help somebody. So I hope you share with me if you can think of something else. And okay, so we'll end on questions that came through Instagram about test knitting. So we will conclude this video by ending on questions that people had on Instagram about test knitting. So Elizabeth is knitting wrote, how tight are the deadlines? What if you fall behind the deadline for being finished? This is a good one. So sometimes test knitting deadlines are really tight, and you'll see that like when you're applying for a test knit, it'll say 4 weeks for a fingering weight short sleeve sweater. And you might be sitting there thinking right now, that's not tight at all. I could easily do that. Okay, so then like, that's good. For me, a fingering weight sweater, I probably would apply for a fingering weight short sleeve sweater in 4 weeks. A fingering weight long sleeve sweater in 4 weeks, I would not do. So, but the good news is usually the application includes the deadline, and so if I find the deadline to be unreasonable, I just don't apply. And the good news though, the very good news, is that most designers have really reasonable test knitting deadlines. So I remember Anna from the Bluebird box last summer, I was test knitting the sweater called the Lennox, and we had like the whole summer to knit this sweater. And in a way that was like, it was a very generous timeline, but in a way that was actually like a detriment to me, because I was like, I've got plenty of time to knit this sweater. And so then I was like doing other things. And so I ended up knitting that right up into the wire, and then being a dramatic test knitter and like running out of yarn and having to use my swatch, and it was like a whole situation. And I think if I had a shorter timeline, I probably wouldn't have done that. So sometimes test knitting deadlines are really long. This Barbie crop, I don't remember how long. I feel like I've had a long time to knit it. I know I'm not done with it, but I feel like I've had I think I've made decisions where I'm not knitting it, but I feel like I've had plenty of time. Like I will do that to myself, where maybe I have, it's like a maybe you're seeing a theme here where I have plenty of time and then I like knit other things because I have so much time. And then I think this is due July 17th, which makes sense. I think the Barbie movie comes out July 21st, so it would be like perfect timing to have this like out when the movie comes out. So yeah, I don't remember all the deadline times, but they are pretty reasonable. And if they're not, like, I don't apply for them. I did one time apply for a 4-week turnaround on a long sleeve sweater, and I just learned that's just not a good choice for me for a long sleeve sweater. So, okay, so Wildflower Magic 18 wrote, how to avoid guilt of not finishing on time. This is real. This is very real. And this is maybe why people don't like test knitting, is the stress of finishing on a deadline and the guilt of like if you don't make it. I don't stress about my knitting. And in a way, I feel like it might be better if I did a little bit, because maybe I would like moderate, and I signed up for a lot of test knits, and so maybe I would sign up for less test knits if I felt any bit of stress. And maybe like if I felt a little bit of stress, I wouldn't have like 30 something whips. So, but I don't let it get me stressed. But the guilt, I have experienced the guilt. And well, I've mentioned it actually. I did finish my vintage vibe vest for Anna on time, but I had guilt, and I still do, that I haven't taken a picture of it. And yeah, and so that's, I guess I don't really have advice on it, but just to say I hear you. For my secret test knit that I referenced earlier in the video, I wasn't going to make the deadline, and I emailed the designer or Instagram messaged her. I don't remember, but I contacted her and asked if I could have some extra time, and she said no problem, and that was really good. And I feel like maybe that happened with my vintage vibe vest too. Maybe I asked for an extra day or two or something. So it just kind of circles back that sometimes the guilt can be remedied by just communication, and then sometimes it's something we just have, I guess. So Knits by Amanda says, how does one become a tech editor, and what does it mean to grade a pattern? Okay, so grading a pattern is when you are doing the math to make other sizes. So for instance, when somebody designs a sweater, they likely have designed it for their body and it'll fit them, but that's just one sweater. And then there's sweaters smaller and sweaters bigger than their body. And so grading is coming up with all of those different sizes. And we were just talking about this last night I have a Zoom knitting as part of this channel, like a Zoom knitting the first Thursday of every month. And at Zoom knitting, we were talking about size inclusivity and how sometimes a pattern will say it's size inclusive because it's graded up to, a 70-inch bust, but that grading is maybe just done linearly. Like if you're doing a raglan where you're increasing down here, just going until you get to the proper amount of bust sizes, like that's not like going into the proper circumference for the bust, like that's not like grading in a size inclusive way, right? Because now the person who, just because they have a large bust doesn't mean that their shoulders are big. Like it doesn't, like the sweater may not fit them properly, right? Like it's the armpit may be down here when they still need the armpit up here. And so grading is a very challenging job that is not just simple linear math. Like it has to be something that's like very conscious on the designer's end or the tech editor's end. I think it's so important, but you also don't want to put a sweater out there in the world that isn't going to fit people's bodies. So tech editor question, how does one become a tech editor? I do not feel like I'm an expert in this area at all. So if anybody knows, I would love if they could answer below. So I will share something cool that's happened in one of my test knits. No, 3 of my test knits. So I've test knit 3 things for Tammy Gore, and in that test knitting process, her tech editor is part of a group. So I'm going to make another video in the future, and that video will be on test knitting formats, like the different ways test knits have been ran. And so I'll save that content for later, but there are different ways that test knits can be run. And in one version that I've been in a group, like a group chat on Instagram, and Tammy Gore loops her tech editor in. And so if there's ever a question, or one time I was in the group, somebody made a mistake. I needed to wanted to complete the project but didn't want to have to rip out their whole yoke, and the tech editor did some quick math for that knitter to finish the rest of their sweater. And I would say that's actually an unusual experience. I don't think I've ever been part of any other test knitting experience where the tech editor's kind of been in the group of test knitters, but I think that that's a model that I quite liked, because the tech editor was ready to answer questions or make adjustments. Well, thank you so much for watching this video about test knitting. If you have any other questions, let me know. I want to make at least one more test knitting video on formats, but if there's any other thing that you'd like to see about test knitting, let me know. If you made it this far in the video and you liked any of the knitting content, consider liking and subscribing. I really love knitting, and I don't think I necessarily want this video to be about making you become a test knitter if you don't want to do it. But if you love knitting like me and you just wanted to know more about test knitting, I hope this helped answer some of your questions today. So happy knitting. Bye!